Welcome back, everybody. This is episode 6. I'm excited today to introduce to you Jennifer Gibson, professional registered dietitian. Um, Jennifer and I studied together at Ryerson University. I'm not sure if we can say that again. My name, David Whalen. This is the Raising Men podcast. Welcome, Jennifer Gibson. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Greetings from Colorado.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. I know I've sort of followed your journey. We haven't really connected a whole lot since you've sort of moved through your professional journey, and obviously watching and seeing. And I know through your LinkedIn profiles and announcements, obviously working with Olympic Canada, uh, Team USA Olympics, as well as the Chicago Bears, New Orleans Saints. Like, how did you take? Tell us a little bit about that journey. How did
Yeah.
you go from, Ryerson University nutrition program to working with some of the most elite programs in the world? How did you make that happen?
Yeah, I think the broad brushstroke word is just big leaps of faith. So yeah, I kind of came out of the school system in Toronto at the time. Like a full-time sport dietitian wasn't really a thing in Canada. That
Yeah.
was like kind of back in 2005. Those
Yeah.
were just us sport nutrition geeks that were like, how do we make this a career?
Yeah.
I remember Dave and I, hanging out at the Ryerson gym all the time, trying to figure out how do we like make this a career. So yeah, so I was working kind of in more of like a business type industry for about a year, and then there was a position that came up, and it was a really poorly paid position to kind of support the Vancouver 2010 Olympics that were going on. And it was, 4 years out before the games and a bit of funding, and it was poorly paid in a very expensive city. And, pretty much nobody wanted the job because they didn't want to get paid that little. But it was an opportunity to support one of the first full-time positions in Canada. And then I kind of was able to then get networked into the international sport nutrition community through kind of linking through all these Olympic sports out in Vancouver. And then that's kind of how it all started. And then I kind of got headhunted down to work with the U.S. Olympic team in Colorado. Usually that's how it goes with Olympic committees. They want people with Olympic experience. And so you kind of headhunt around the world for people. And then my journey down here in the States kind of lent itself to, again, starting to network with some people in the NFL. And then that translated into some work with the Saints, which then translated into 7 years in Chicago with Chicago Bears as their sports science and coordinator and dietitian. So it's been a fun 16 years. I never in a million years growing up in Toronto, being a Leafs fan, would be thinking I'm working in the NFL. But that's just how life, had it for me.
That's awesome. I love what I do, but I can't help but say that I am a little bit jealous. As I said, I've watched your journey through the LinkedIn profile and just seeing all these incredible things. And it's also amazing to see people that we've gone to school with that, have come a long way and created something from it. I know studying nutrition, food nutrition, as you're saying, it's hard to find, outside of working in a hospital clinical setting, it's hard to find a way to take that education and turn it into something. Obviously you've done an incredible job of that. I've tried to make the best of it as well. And I think that, it's an incredible industry and there's a lot of information, that's out there. And obviously somebody like yourself and the experiences that you had, it's just powerful. So congratulations on all your success. That's amazing. I know, now you're living in Colorado, and I know through our conversations, obviously a beautiful spot there. So again, congratulations on all of that. I guess as we've talked, so the podcast itself called Raising Men is really here to help support men, parents, people raising children, sort of navigating through life. And so having you on board, what I'm hoping to accomplish today is to provide some insight into, maybe some things that parents or even elite athletes, men themselves, and this could apply to women, how could they best prepare themselves, what are some things that you would suggest in the nutrition world that you've seen, experienced? Um, what are maybe some easy, quick hits, or some pieces of information that you could provide to people in general? What comes to mind as I bring that up?
Yeah. So yeah, my career has really been spent with, the most elite athletes,
Hmm.
and I say that because oftentimes, um, the developmental athletes, the young athletes and parents that are kind of taking their kids all around the city and all around the country to participate in hockey or baseball or soccer. That's a lot of the young kids, and some of the parents, that's the aspirations they have for their kids.
Hmm.
And something that is really top of mind for me right now is actually, one of the most intriguing things about working with elite athletes is some of the ones that are the most successful are actually the ones that are most self-sufficient,
Hmm.
and and that has to also do with their nutrition,
Hmm.
because all of a sudden they're being carted around and kind of catered to, and they don't even know how to grocery shop. They don't know how to cook.
Hmm.
They don't even really understand nutrition because they're just used to it being handed to them.
Hmm.
And then at some point in their careers, especially if they continue to elevate or they go to an academy or they maybe live away from home or go to university, um, they are just kind of plopped by the alien parents into this foreign environment, and they don't really know how to actually have those life skills.
Hmm.
And so that's actually been an interesting one where, you have these, like some of these pro athletes that come onto the team, and they really have no clue how to survive nutritionally on their own.
Uh-huh.
But that's just one thing that's actually a really practical thing that spans every sport, every, self-sufficiency. So sometimes I'll talk to parents about, have your kid pack their own nutrition, take
Hmm.
them to the grocery store and actually have them like talk to you about the choices that you're making. If they are going away for a tournament, have a checklist that you develop with them and have them pack for it. And there might be kind of some parents that just begrudge that, or as they get a little bit older, that's really important
I love
because,
that. That's
um,
awesome.
yeah, because as they do end up journeying off, we joke around in our industry and say, you can't nutrition your way into a win, but you can certainly nutrition your way out of one. And
That's powerful.
yeah, and I just gave a big kind of lecture to one of our Canadian national teams actually heading off to a World Cup in England.
Hmm.
And they, a lot of these athletes had never been overseas before. They were going to be gone for a month.
Hmm.
And there's a huge impact that can be had in your performance if you lose 15 pounds because you're a picky eater,
Hmm.
or can't figure out how to navigate, living in a hotel for a month. We did it at the Olympic Games all the time. It was trying to really help them through that time of travel and being away and
Hmm.
being self-sufficient that way. So that's kind of like a really general thing. But honestly, if you don't have that foundation of being able to take care of yourself, once you
Hmm.
kind of get to those elite levels, or your son or daughter's traveling on their own for a tournament, and they kind of all of a sudden go rogue and just eat gummy bears all day, and that's just not normal
Yeah.
strategy, it really can impact their performance. So that's kind of an interesting one that's a real basic, but
Mm.
interestingly enough, even at the elite level, some of the guys coming to us were like, okay, we got to figure out how to navigate life on your own here.
So what would be, let's say I'm sending off an elite athlete, or even a child athlete. I'm sending them to an event, a tournament. What are some must-haves or must-dos that I would suggest, or want to make sure? I mean, I'm just from our experience in school, obviously hydration, protein, carbohydrates, but what in that genre, I guess, or what would you suggest? How would you say make sure you get XYZ?
Yeah. So truthfully, what you want to do is have practiced your sport nutrition habits
Mhm.
throughout all of your training. And then when you go to your competition environment, you really just want to replicate what you're familiar with.
Okay.
And so that's kind of the model that we use all the time. We test and test and test throughout the week,
Mhm.
trialing what works for us, what sits well in our gut. And then when we go away, we just try to replicate that. And
Okay.
so that's an important part of having your child go away as well. Is if they're used to having, let's say, a PB&J and a banana before they skate or they play,
Mhm.
then that goes with them. and you kind of try to keep that consistency of what they're used to fueling with that's been successful for them. Same thing with hydration. I know with young kids, they can kind of get all over the map with that type of stuff. And there's some interesting hydration vessels out there. You might have seen them that have kind of ounces or cups, and they kind of are like these big jugs, and they kind of have measurements on them.
Yeah.
But in a way, that can be a cueing tool for your athlete throughout the week. You kind of say, okay, we want to make sure you're having at least a cup of fluid before you go out there, and then throughout training, we want you to have this much, and you can kind of cue that with your athlete. And then again, when you're going away to competition, you kind of have to have that dialed in and part of their practice plan that they're used to doing already. When I used to do some travel nutrition stuff with younger athletes, what we used to also prep for them would be these little kind of cue cards. And they were just like these little pieces of paper with just your pre, during, and post reminders. And they kind of be, tacked onto the outside of their fueling bag. And you kind of have these fueling bags that were pretty shelf stable that could kind of travel along with them. And that, again, they're just kind of replicating what they already know. Because that's usually when we get into trouble, is like when we kind of freestyle or we're away for the tournament and logistically we miss something and they haven't eaten for 4 hours before the event, or something happens that way where they just don't have access to foods logistically. And that's usually where things kind of go off the rails.
Are there things that you would tell parents or athletes to avoid? Are there sort of a short list of things that you would say, this is not a good idea?
Yep.
Stay away from XYZ.
Yeah. So with the youth athlete, something that's being used and abused these days are energy drinks. So over caffeinating a young central nervous system is not a good idea. There might be an initial kind of burst of energy that comes out of that, but there's kind of a bit of a crash that happens after that can sometimes, again, be a detriment to performance. Or if the athlete is participating over a tournament where they have multiple games, you just can't keep, having caffeine in and expecting the same result.
Yeah.
And we worry a little bit about youth and kind of overuse of caffeine just because it is a stimulant. Worry a little bit about their bone health, and also worry about the psychology of them believing that they need this beverage to perform. That's one thing, that we really, and don't get me wrong, caffeine is a great ergogenic aid and we use it at an elite level, but it's very calculated, and there's a lot of thought and application to how that goes in. But sometimes with young youth athletes, you just see them pounding Red Bulls or whatever, and you're just like, okay, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Not to mention disturbed sleep as well. The other thing I would say is, so we usually don't recommend like high fat, heavy foods, beforehand, just because it takes long for that to digest in the system. Usually I try to just educate athletes by saying, what are you going to be using for your event? And 99% of the time, if it's not just a real skill-based sport, it's going to be carbohydrate, fluid and electrolytes, and there will be some protein, damage going on. So we use that to cue us and say, okay, well, those are the things you need to pre-fuel with. And you can kind of adjust the ratios based on the type of sport you're doing. So if I'm doing a more aerobic based sport, my carbohydrate ratios may be a bit higher. If I'm looking at more of a strength and power sport, then maybe my carbohydrate might be a little bit lower, but I'll have a little bit more protein. And we just kind of fuel with what our body is going to be doing. If I'm playing in a hot environment, I'm going to emphasize my fluids and electrolytes, right? Because those are going to be going out the door more. So we kind of look at what's your sport in your kind of competitive environment, and then let's fuel appropriately according to your body weight. And, everything gets pretty technical in terms of the individual. But we really try to avoid, heavy, pizza, fried food, things that are going to just sit in your gut, because they're just going to sit there and cause GI distress. And then we're probably avoiding overstimulating your central nervous system, because again, that's not going to result in a consistent performance either.
So what would be, we're talking about hydration and carbohydrates. What would be ideal sources of carbohydrates and ideal sources for hydration?
So there's ideal and then there's practical, but So ideal for me, and I love rice. I
Uh,
love rice.
yeah.
It's really easily digestible. It's one of the most hypoallergenic foods on the planet. No
Hmm.
one really has a rice allergy or
Hmm.
intolerance. So
Yep.
for me,
Love it.
I love rice.
Hmm.
So it could be, either rice within a meal, the context of a meal. So rice and some sort of like chicken breast or, fish product.
Hmm.
Um, or it could be actually within like a chicken and rice soup,
Hmm.
something where it's easily, again, a practical perspective,
Hmm.
something like that, or a stir fry.
Hmm.
So I love rice. That's my number one go-to for exercise, just because it absorbs really well. The gut
Hmm.
tolerates it really well. So for pre-training and stuff, and pre-competition, it's great.
Hmm.
And then in terms of like protein choices and stuff like that, yeah, you're kind of looking at your leaner proteins. Obviously chicken breasts are great, but then you can also, again, depending on the practicality of your environment, you could also do things like a protein powder or like a protein shake.
Hmm.
Um, that would be something that you could also implement to get your protein in there. And then in terms of like hydration, there's about a million different sport products out there. I'm
Yeah.
not, I'm not aligned with anybody in particular.
Hmm.
Um, but what I will say is just one that most of them are kind of formulated, generally speaking, to give you some sort of carbohydrate and some sodium. Whether or not you need the extra carb from your sport drink really will depend on the type of sport you're engaging in. So
Hmm.
again, if you're not a sport that's chewing through a lot of muscle glycogen, you're not a heavy endurance sport, you
Hmm.
probably, if you're fueling properly with food, you probably don't need extra carbs during your workout, so to
Hmm.
speak. Um, and it's because some parents worry about, am I giving my kid too much of the simple sugars and things
Hmm.
like that? Really, it depends on what's going on.
Hmm.
Um, but those simple sugars can be handy if your child or your athlete is not fueling properly ahead of time, because you do need that carbohydrate for energy. So if the
Hmm.
pre-fueling situation isn't great, or you may not have access to be able to kind of supplement nutrition during the event, then
Hmm.
having that extra carbohydrate can work too.
Yeah. One of the things that I've, through my work that I've tried to educate is that I agree with the concept that sugar itself is something you need to manage. But there are times when sugar can be of benefit. And in situations where you need to hydrate quickly,
Yep.
um, that it can be of positive use. Obviously, we want to cut down the amount of sugar that someone's taking in. But, I feel like there's a bit of misinformation out there
Yeah.
around the topic of avoid sugar completely.
Yep.
As we know, in a clinical situation, if you're dehydrated, you're going to be getting an IV fluid of sugar, sodium, and obviously water. There's specific ratios that they've studied within dietetics to show proper hydration. So I fear sometimes that we, especially in the sports nutrition industry, that there's this level of marketing pushing this anti-sugar movement. And obviously having somebody like yourself that's worked at a high level, I think there's value sometimes to some sugar to some degree,
Yeah.
not pumping sodas and junk food, but saying, there is some value. And even um, you know looking at some of the original hydration formulas that were developed through the University of Florida, um, that there's actual clinical research to why
Oh,
they
yeah.
have such a thing. So
Yeah.
if you want to
Yeah.
touch on
Agree 100%. I think so many different things about this topic, but
that.
um, I think what people a lot of times, okay, first of all, anytime you take one type of food and you make it the enemy, that's
Mhm.
that's just a big red flag in our world,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because truthfully, all foods can fit.
Mhm.
And so if you're going to take away your child's birthday cake because it
Mhm.
has sugar in it, well, I'm sorry. We got to talk more a little bit about the psychological damage you're inflicting on your child. And that's
Yeah.
the other thing too is and I've done a lot of work just looking at food psychology and kind of healthy relationships with food. And
Mhm.
especially with kids, the minute you start kind of demonizing food groups or having them kind of have certain reactions to that, there is an element of that where then that becomes forbidden fruit. And then we have had situations where they go and sneak to a friend's house and binge eat on it because they can't have it at home. So just having a healthy relationship with that. I have a 2.5-year-old, and I've done a lot of reading about, I want to make sure she has a healthy relationship with food. And it's funny,
Absolutely.
if I give her a little cookie, and just let herself regulate, a lot of times she may not eat the whole thing just because it's just kind of a thing, but if you make it into this huge event or this huge treat, or, something where it's bigger than it is, then there's a psychology piece that comes into that. So that's one piece that I'm always thinking about when it comes to, our young athletes and kind of how we frame foods. But then ultimately what we have to remember is that every carbohydrate that we eat coming from a whole grain piece of bread or a sweet potato or rice or whatever it is, it all breaks down to sugar anyway. So when we digest it and take it into our body, it all ends up as a sugar molecule anyway.
Yeah.
And so what we're looking at is something that's already I always say, it's already there. It's already at that last level of digestion and absorption. And so there's always there is a time and a place where it can really be helpful. And so when I'm fueling athletes in the middle of a 3-hour football game and I need quick energy that's easy to digest and is going to get into their system very quickly, you betcha I've got simple sugar options out there coming in some sort of shot block or sport nutrition product that usually has a little bit of extra electrolytes, but the primary thing is sugar. And it's absolutely appropriate for that time and place. And their body's chewing it up and using it in that moment. So it's
muscle glycogen just depleting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing I talk to our athletes about too, is time and place, and is it being utilized? And what we worry about, obviously, with the obesity epidemic, is that you're taking in all this extra sugar that you don't need because you're not running a marathon, and you're giving your body all this extra energy and it has nowhere to go. So it gets stored. So that's what we're worried about. But if you're dealing with a young, super active child or a young athlete that's really kind of burning literally the candle at both ends, there's a time and a place where it works, and there shouldn't be any guilt or any sort of like shaming that goes on for that type of practice.
Yeah. I, as a real world example, so my oldest son, he plays on a hockey team, and his coach, he has a boy that's 17 that is like a beast of an athlete. He got drafted to the OHL. And so I've spent some time with him. And because he's a bigger athlete, he looks like a football linebacker, but he plays hockey. And he's a tank. Like, I think this kid genuinely, if he gets the proper advice and training, I genuinely think this kid has some potential to play, because he's talented. He's a smart player, but he's also big and strong. What I noticed is that because he's big, he's gotten so much misinformation from, hack nutritionists that will say, you got to cut this, you got to cut that, cut your calories, don't eat, avoid this. And I said to his dad, I said, one thing is, I'm noticing that he has a negative relationship with food. For a number of reasons. And then secondly, this kid's a beast. Like, he needs to understand when and why and how to eat, so that he can perform at his best all the time, and not to have shame because he wants to eat some good quality foods or because he's hungry. And so I love what you're saying there. And I love the fact that, each athlete, depending on their sport, depending on who they are, and digestion, I love educating families and parents. And, that's really a crucial piece of it. I think there's so much misinformation around all these different things in nutrition. And I really appreciate having you on to help validate that information and to really put things in perspective. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. In the case of that athlete, the one thing that comes to my mind is just, he's got a genetic gift.
Yeah.
And I've seen it so many times. Even at the highest level, you have someone who's so talented, but they're just slightly maybe different than the way that people think that position should look like. And then we try to get them to lose weight or gain weight or go one way or the other. But it's
Yeah.
like, no, 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 no. This is their unique genetic profile
Mm.
that you can't actually change very
Mm.
much because it's
Yeah.
very genetically predetermined. If you're just a husky, endomorphic, or mesomorphic guy, that's who you are. And then we mess around with them, and we get to that phrase where, like I said, you can't nutrition your way to a win, but you can definitely nutrition your way out. And that's
Mhm.
what ends up happening. They underperform a lot of times because they're underfueled or overfueled, or they're, and then you dampen that talent because you're messing around with something you should just let alone and let them fuel properly for who they are.
Yeah, I felt like for that athlete that I'm speaking of, I felt
Yes.
like teaching him how to eat properly and when and how and why, will avoid hiding foods or, having some level of shame around whatever it is they're doing. Obviously, he's an elite athlete. Obviously, he has some talent. He didn't get there just randomly overnight.
Yeah.
And I think there just needs to be a better understanding again, like the lack of quality nutrition information that exists out there is key.
Yeah.
And one of the other questions that I have is this whole topic of protein, because obviously I spent a lot of time in bodybuilding. I feel like there's this like excessive focus on protein. And I know as our time with Susie Langley in the sports nutrition program, she was, very big on carbohydrates, but can you add some clarity? I feel like sometimes people are taking in too much protein and not understanding why or when and how. And maybe if you could add some information there.
Sure. Yeah. It's a big, big topic. So when you look at the sport nutrition literature and all the research and looking at deep research that looks at, like, nitrogen balance and
Mm.
things that look at kind of how your protein is metabolized and how much your body can actually take in,
Mm.
we kind of all have a consensus that
Mm.
even if you're a bodybuilder, even if you're at the very high end of a really strength and power sport, that we usually aren't going past like 2 grams of protein per kilo body weight.
And that's
Like
per kilo.
per
Yeah.
kilo.
So
So yeah, you gotta do
not
the
per
math at home.
pound, per
Per
kilo.
per
Yeah.
kilo,
For
exactly.
Canadians, we're talking kilo.
Yes, I'm talking kilos, and I talk kilos down here too.
That's awesome.
But we usually do the math around
Mm.
that. Now, let me tell you, that's the upper end. So this is for like strength and power sports. This is for
Yeah.
my football guys that need to have huge amounts of lean body mass. This is for our bodybuilder, like people that is, a big, and there's recommendations for protein based on different, categories of sport. And so obviously if you're down on like the endurance end,
Mm.
1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilo.
So if I can stop you for 1 second, just because
Mhm.
I want to bring it in, because I totally am on the same page
Yes,
with you,
yes.
and I love what you're saying. So I'm roughly 110 kilos. So just so that we're
Yeah.
doing the math together, and somebody's listening to this podcast, and they're saying, okay, so the extreme end, we're talking about like NFL, linebacker, 300-pound guy that's running, he's an elite guy. So I'm 110 kilos, about 230 pounds. So we multiply that by 2, that would be the upper end. I would be ingesting
Yes.
basically 220 grams of protein in a total day. And then
Yes.
I would break that up into smaller meals throughout the day,
Yes.
just so that somebody listening to this kind
Oh,
of
yeah. No,
understands.
that's very practical. Yep.
But yeah, and then
And
so
that's the upper limit. And
yeah,
so, like, if you look at the dietary requirements for like normal people that aren't
mm,
elite athletes,
yeah,
again, depending on what nation you're in, and there's lots of different camps on this, but between 0.8
mhm,
and 1 grams per kilo
mm,
body weight. So that's half of what you were just mentioning,
yeah,
110 grams. So really, when we're determining protein intakes, we kind of start with those guidelines. And generally speaking, as you've just said, like, people are like, oh, that's a little bit less than I thought. Because
mm,
hey, guess what? There's also protein in your breakfast cereal, and there's
yeah,
protein, there's little bits of extra protein that kind of come around throughout the day than you just having your big protein shakes.
yeah,
So yeah, generally speaking, people probably need less than they think they do.
mhm,
it's definitely been a marketing ploy to add protein to everything. It's kind of the
Yeah.
um, it's kind of like the golden child macro these days.
Yeah.
And so I think that's it's really hard, I think, to be, and it's hard for me, and I know it's hard for you to be a nutrition professional in the current environment, because there's diet culture and food media, and there's people trying to sell a lot of stuff right now. So there's a lot of confusing mixed messaging.
Yeah,
Um,
I think, and just again, this is for people listening. You know, Jennifer is a professional registered dietitian. She's worked for the Olympic teams in Canada and the U.S. and numerous NFL football teams. This is information at the highest level. So this is not, a weekend crash course nutritionist. This is
yeah,
not somebody that's just spewing information or trying to sell product. This is based on clinical data and research and been shown at the top levels of athletes. So I just want people to understand that's where the information is coming from. And I appreciate you, Jennifer, for being here and for helping to clarify that. The other piece that I want to add to that, because I get this question all the time, is what type of protein? And this is just my perspective, and obviously I would love to hear yours. But I always try to say there's not a holy grail of protein. I love eggs. I think eggs in terms of nutritional value are amazing, but I think that and this is my personal perspective, but I don't think you can sit or rest on one type of protein, and having variety in your life is obviously, again, in my opinion, I feel like it adds value and ensures that you're getting a different mix of amino acids and other nutrients that are important. And I'd love your feedback.
yeah, 100%. I mean, here when I plan my protein for the week, we use variety. Exactly. We use eggs a lot, obviously in the morning. And I have to be careful, because even with my daughter, I'm always thinking, okay, do I have all her macros here?
Yep.
Yeah, and we'll do, like, twice a week, we'll do some sort of salmon, or like a hard, healthy fish as our protein source.
Yep.
We'll use a lot of chicken and ground beef. And, for me, where I start to look at my protein is the quality of my protein. So like in our house, we do only organic protein, but that's just our personal choice. But yeah, like, so exactly, the variety is going to give you all the kind of fun little micronutrients and things that come along with them. Your fatty fishes are going to have more omega-3s. Your red meat products are going to have more iron in them. Your chicken is going to be a nice lean source, and pork is going to be a nice lean source that's easy to digest. So having that variety all in there, and then getting fun, and we do some meatless days here as well. So really trying to get into meat-free days, and kind of helping to improve your protein intake from more plant-based sources. So beans or legumes, or experimenting with tofu or tempeh, doing chilies and stuff like that. So it still feels like there's lots of substance there, but you're getting some alternative protein in there as well. And so I think I'm with you. You got to have, if you have the whole spectrum and kind of diversify that way, then not only getting the micro and macronutrient kind of differences in all of those, but then you're developing a palate, if you're fueling a young athlete, to help them get out into the world, so that they're not always just wanting chicken all the time. and they can kind of, sustain themselves on different types of protein.
And I think that digestion, as you mentioned much earlier, digestion is key. And I think that having variety helps the digestive system to deal with those different types of foods. Food preparation is key. Again, I mean, not stealing the show, but making sure that people are not, necessarily eating a ton of fried foods, or overly processed foods, trying to find as natural sources as possible, and then and having quality sources, then preparing them well. And again, ultimately, like what you're saying, for the athlete, is digestion is huge. So when you're looking at the different types of proteins or foods or meals, how is it working with that athlete? How do they feel? But yeah, I love what you're saying, and I love what you're bringing, obviously, with your education and experience and professionalism. So thank you very much.
Of course, yeah.
One of the topics that I wanted to ask, obviously, a woman working in high level professional sports, working with these high level athletes. And because the podcast is geared towards men, and raising men, what are some things that you've noticed on maybe a psychological level, on as men, what can we do? Not necessarily nutritionally, but potentially nutritionally. What can we do? What are some perspectives? What have you seen? What could we do to be better?
Yeah. So I've spent, the last probably at least 7, but probably closer to 9 years working with exclusively male athletes.
Mhm.
It's been an interesting journey to when I started at the Bears, I was the first woman there that they ever hired to work with the guys. So I was
Wow.
literally literally 150 between coaches and players. And then there's just me.
Yeah.
So I kind of got really immersed in maleness.
Yeah.
um, and I think just one of the things that I observed, and just from being kind of a neutral ground for guys to come to talk to, not only
Mhm.
about their nutrition and diet, but just about life,
Mhm.
was generally speaking, especially in kind of these all male sports. Yeah, there's definitely a culture there that I've observed of just that, I hate to say it, it's pretty stereotypical, but
No,
it's
it's
just
all
kind of
good.
that, it's just kind of that tough guy.
Yeah.
Um, One thing that I found really interesting about the environment I was in was it was just constantly, they would joke around by just tearing each other down. Like
Mhm.
if someone had some acne, for example, they would just rip that guy about the acne. Or if someone
Yeah.
smelled bad, do you wear deodorant? It's just
Mhm.
the banter among men was just a lot of just tearing each other down. And it was just a
Mhm.
cultural thing, I guess, but it was just kind of how they did it.
Mhm.
And I remember just thinking to myself, wow, if that was someone was saying that to me, if girls kind of did that, we would all be off, so insecure and
Mhm.
feeling awful about ourselves. But there was something interesting to me about that. I'm like, is this how all male locker rooms are, where they just kind of tear at each other, as part of their culture?
Mhm.
But it's something I observed for a long time. And so that was something I thought was interesting. And then actually did impact some of the guys psychologically, because they get picked on, or a little bit of kind of bullying and things like
Mhm.
that. And that was something that I thought was interesting, and kind of trying to figure out ways to be a safe person to kind of not engage in that type of culture. That was important to me. I was always the one that was building them up, encouraging them, and just trying to kind of derail some of that stuff that was going on. It was all done in love, but it was just
Mhm.
kind of a weird way that they interacted.
Yeah,
Um,
not to interrupt you, but I
no, no.
think there is, and again, part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast, in general, is that I think as a male growing up in sports, and in general, I think when other men are insecure, and people in general, but a lot of times with men, they will find something to make fun of someone else, to sort of shine the light on them and take it
Yep.
away from themselves. Um, and I think that, obviously we want to be, I think there's value to being strong, confident men, but I think we're raised to sort of, not deal with emotions or feelings in a certain way. And it's great that you're obviously adding the perspective that you've had. I think in hopefully some way in this podcast, as it moves forward, that we can help to educate. I think there's a lack of education for men on understanding why they're doing that it doesn't really help or add value, and that you can still be big and strong and all those things. And I think actually, you know, I think there's this stigma that men in some way feel like they're more masculine by tearing someone else down. And while in fact, they're less masculine when they have to, attack somebody for their challenges, if that makes sense. So I think there's some education that needs to happen around there. But yeah, I love the perspective that you're adding.
Yeah, and I think something that I've learned about working in the most elite level of sport is that everyone kind of thinks this is it. This is where I want to go. I want to be in the NHL. I want to be in the NFL. I want to make the money. I want to have the glory and the fame. And
Mhm.
and there's a lot of loneliness that goes on with these guys. And sometimes when you're given everything,
Mhm.
that you still have life problems. They're still human beings. They still have tragedy. They still have loss. They still have insecurity. It's like, it doesn't change problems,
Mhm.
and so it's not the answer to everything. It's, even having a lot of money makes life a lot more complicated for a lot of these guys.
Mhm.
And so it was always interesting to me to just work with a population that had everything, and yet they still, in some cases, dealt with um, just even more issues by being engaged in that lifestyle. You're in a situation where, for a lot of my guys, their careers are 3 to 4 years. You can have a longer career in hockey, I get it, but
Mhm.
in football, you have a career for 3 to 4 years on average. And for a
Mhm.
lot of these guys, this is it. So they have 3 to 4 years to make the most amount of money they will make for their entire lives. And so picture your career
Yeah.
and me saying to you, you gotta actually, that's it. You get 3 to 4 years and you have to make everything. The highest earning you're going to have is when you're 21, 22, 23,
Yeah.
and you're going to have to make it in 3 to 4 years. And
Wow.
then you're done, because that's it. You have kind of a degree that doesn't really get you anywhere. You've never worked a normal job. Um, and the 1% of them make the mega bucks, but a lot of them are just making league minimum. So there's a lot of pressure to that, and there's
Mhm.
just a lot. It's a really intense time for these guys, not to
Mhm.
mention all the toll they put on their bodies. So yeah, it's just, it's one of those things where it's like we all want to go there and it's awesome, but trust me, it's a different world, and it takes its own, unique coping mechanisms to survive at the pro level as well.
Yeah. No, thank you very, very much. I I guess to sort of round out today's podcast, is maybe to ask yourself, are there, out of everything we've talked about, or maybe something we have not, is there something that you wanted to add, or some quick hits, or something that you feel like people should know coming away from our conversations? There's something I have not asked, um, that might be helpful.
Sure. I think something that people often ask me about is like, what's my nutrition philosophy,
Hmm.
And I think it's actually a really helpful one that's really, really helps to kind of get rid of all the noise of nutrition out there. And so, generally, what I talk to a lot of people about is this concept of eating first generation foods. And they
Hmm.
don't know what that means at first, but basically, what it is if you can try to have your diet, 90% of your diet with first generation foods, you're doing a good job. And a first generation food is a food that is pretty much exactly how it came out of the ground or was naturally found. So
Hmm.
for example, a potato is a first generation food that just
Hmm.
came out of the ground. Here I am, a potato.
Yeah.
The minute I take that potato and make it into French fries, I've taken it a few generations away from its original form.
Yes.
Rice is another example. If we start looking at bread, hey, that's been adulterated a little bit along the way from the original wheat
Hmm.
husk.
Yeah.
But if you start to think about things like that, what are first generation foods? They're fruits, they're vegetables, and a lot of times like meat, here's chicken breast that just came right off the chicken. Here's an egg that just came right out.
Mm.
So if we start to kind of build our plates and kind of think about our snacks, nuts, um, again, fresh fruits and vegetables, things like that, and build out like 90% of our nutrition with that philosophy of trying to have a first generation food presence, we
Mm.
kind of take away a lot of processed foods and kind of a lot of mysterious things that we might think, is this a really new product? This
Mm.
interesting like egg wrap that I microwave for 5 minutes. It says it's keto friendly,
Yeah. Yeah.
if you just kind of go back to that philosophy, it helps a lot.
Mm.
And remembering that that's 90%. And then the 10%, go and have a party, enjoy some cake, have
Mm.
a slice of pie, have a glass of wine, whatever it is that is fun for you, because food is fun and social. And the reason why I'm a dietitian is because I grew up in an Italian family where we love food. It wasn't about nutrition, it was about food.
Yeah.
Uh, and the love of food and the comfort it brings and the family around it. So that kind of philosophy I try to impart a lot on my athletes as well, is we can have fun and social times. And as long as that's like 10%, you're good,
Mm.
but trying to build your foundation with first generation foods is kind of an easy way to think about it without having to look at a guide or count macros. And a lot of times you clean up a lot of the things out of your diet by thinking about that philosophy.
Yeah, I love that. I try, so part of my like journey through professional history. I mentored with a master herbalist, and I studied Ayurveda, sort of the oldest form of medicine that we know of. And I always talk to families as if, um, our minds, our brains don't know that there's a store or a fridge or, fast food restaurant. Um, I try to suggest that we treat our food as we would have thousands of years ago, in a sense that, can I go and get that, um, from the ground, or can I, you know, um, you know, catch an animal, and those types of things is sort of the, as you're saying, first generation foods. I love that philosophy. I think it makes the most sense. I think there's a lot of like food processing and marketing and all this stuff that goes on that actually, as we said earlier, from what you were suggesting, that it impacts digestion negatively. So sticking to the original foods that your mind and your body and all those things are used to, processing internally, is going to help. And obviously, still having that one-off fun time, or whatever the case may be, not necessarily avoiding all processed foods. However, trying to stick to a higher percentage of first generation foods, as you're suggesting. So I love that. And I agree. I think that, when we're shopping, I think they used to teach us to spend most of your time on the outside aisles and a lot less on the inside aisles in the store, because, the inside aisles are usually where all the processed foods are. Finding ways to naturally hydrate and naturally get carbohydrates. And anyway, so yeah, I love that first generation concept, and I think that everybody should definitely apply that.
Awesome. Yeah.
And is there anything else that you wanted to add today as we're wrapping this up?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Is there anything else I want to add? I
Mhm.
think it's interesting. I've been to the mountaintop of sport, and well, I think I just want to reiterate that, the grass isn't always greener, and it's not that it's a negative place, but at the highest level of sport,
Mm,
I joke around that it's actually becomes really unhealthy, for
mhm,
these athletes, because their body becomes literally their job, and the amount of wear and tear they put on it is just not natural.
mm,
Um, and so, yeah, again, it's kind of one of those things where we all want to get to the mountaintop, but then once you're here, there's pros and cons to it as well. So,
mm,
in terms of just engaging in that, and being an athlete in that. So, I just kind of like to encourage parents to just love their kid where they're at and where their achievement gets them to. But if they don't go all the way, that's perfectly okay. And that just, they're going to excel at wherever they end up, so I've just worked with a lot of times with parents that are just, their dreams are sometimes just, if they don't make it all the way, then there's a failure,
yeah.
and it's like, absolutely not, because trust me, at the highest level, maybe you get a little paid a little bit more, but
Mm.
again, it's a concentrated amount of time. And it's its own world of kind of craziness, once you're there.
Yeah, again, I love that, and I love your perspective, and I know that we spoke yesterday, before the podcast, and you'd mentioned that, especially in the U.S., there's a lot of dads that are so focused on getting their child a scholarship, that it's all about the athletics, and I think that's a powerful concept for anyone listening to this, and especially dads or parents that, you know. I try a lot more now, and I'm learning through this whole process myself. My kids are involved in high level sports, and I'm trying more to just be dad and say, you know what, son, and I got this actually from one of our past podcast sessions, Power Tech, we had on, and they were saying, like, tell your son or your daughter, I love you. I love watching you play, and I'm happy to come and watch, and focus on that energy, and have them love the sport, have them love what they're doing, and enjoy it, and not necessarily playing to live out the parent's dream, or necessarily try to accomplish something. And there's a small percentage of athletes that will ever get to the top, and And I think there is value in what you're saying, in that, a lot of men place their personal self-value on whether or not they achieve the highest level of sport, or they're the breadwinner at home, or they're accomplished something of some sort. And if they don't, that they're just not good enough. And I definitely, with my own personal challenges in life, I don't want my boys to ever feel like, because they didn't accomplish something, that they weren't good enough. And I think that's important. And I love that perspective that you added. So thank you very much.
Of course. It's been great. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. I hope we can do it again. I think out of this podcast, we're probably going to get a lot of questions in terms of what people want to know in nutrition and sport nutrition. And I'd love to have you on again.
Awesome.
Again, Jennifer Gibson, professional registered dietitian. I love having you on. I'm so happy that we reconnected.
I know.
I can't wait to share this, and I hope we can do it again. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
Of course.
I hope you have a great day.
You too.
David Whalen and Jennifer Gibson. This is episode 6, the Raising Men podcast. Thank you guys. Enjoy your day. Keep well.